Good morning to everybody. I am Alessandra Venturini, the holder of the Jean Monnet Chair in European Migration Studies, financed by the European Commission and based at the University of Torino. I'm very glad today to open the third lecture of the second edition of the seminar Cocumint, Consumption of Cultural Goods as Driver of Migrant Integration. The seminar is interdisciplinary, with economists, with contribution by economists, anthropologists, social scientists, linguists, demographer, and by an artist who is very involved in the social inclusion. Last year we had Michelangelo Pistoletto, and this year we had Marinella Senatore, who is a young, amazing artist. Today we are very happy that Hillel Rapoport has accepted our invitation. Hillel is professor of economics at the Paris School of Economics. He was member of the Bar-Ilan University Economic Department. He was also visiting Stanford University for 2 years, Harvard for 3 years. He was also with the European University Institute Migration Policy Center. She visits many places. Since 2008, he is the scientific coordinator of the Migration and Development Conference, jointly organized by the French Developing Agency and the World Bank. He received many prizes, the Milken Institute Award, the Developing Country Prize, and so on. His research focuses on growth and development impact on migration. As part of his research program, he has done theoretical empirical work on the brain drain, remittances, the effect of migration on inequality, the educational attainment, and the link between migration and other dimensions of globalization, such as trade, capital flow, but also culture and diversity. I immensely appreciate Hillel because he always tackles new, a highly relevant topic, but also because when I ask him a very confused and confusing question, he always explained to me what I wanted to say, to ask, and also the answer is very clear. So Hillel, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Alessandra, and thank you to the participants for attending, especially with not only, of course, the people I know, and I'm happy to see again, at least virtually. So the title for this presentation is Migration and Cultural Change. This is a paper that Gustavo has seen at a very, very preliminary stage, and Alessandra also, I believe, because the very first version of this paper was presented by Sulin, one of the, at the time we were just two co-authors, so Sulin and myself, and it was presented for the first time at the Migration and Development Conference we had at EUI, at the Migration Policy Institute in Florence in June 2016. So it's almost 6 years ago, and this paper is not yet published. It took us about 4 years to have a working paper, even more. The first working paper version we published was in the fall of 2020, so a year and a half ago. And we are still working on it. There have been many changes since that first version. The main one, as you can see on this slide, actually two, the title has changed. It's now Migration and Cultural Change, and we have a third co-author, Arthur Silve, who is associate professor at Laval University in Quebec. And at the time, Sulin Sardosho was my PhD student at PSC, and she's now junior professor of migration economics at Humboldt University Berlin. Now, what are we going to talk about in this paper? I think if you try to guess from the title, and given that we are in Europe, and most of you are Italian, and when you think about migration and culture, we think about populism essentially, and the cultural backlash against globalization in general and against immigration. So yes, we will talk about this. Many people discuss whether this is an economic reaction or a cultural reaction. And I think for countries such as Italy, France, and the United States, I think it's fair to say that most of the concern, most of the political debate about immigration is more about identity and culture than about sheer economic benefits or costs of migration. So we will talk about this aspect of the migration and cultural change relationship, which is the fact that immigrants can potentially change the culture of the places they immigrate to. And this is an old concern, as you can see from this quote from Thomas Jefferson more than 2 centuries ago, at the time of the American Revolution. And what you see here is essentially that Jefferson was concerned that with immigrants coming from Europe, which were all European countries except France, not yet, it's 1785, so including France, were absolutist monarchies. So he was concerned that these immigrants with their political culture of absolutism would be a threat to the American democracy, that they would disseminate their political views and their principles to the populations, the citizens of the United States. So this dimension that immigrants can bring the culture with them, they can have a compositional effect on the culture of the country, the receiving country, but they can also, not just compositionally, they can also disseminate their own culture, and this is seen as a threat, of course, from the viewpoint of the receiving country, which is which loves its own culture. This in today's context, I think people would the first thing that comes to mind is the issue of Muslim immigrants in Europe, with this risk of this cultural threat that they will again disseminate their own culture. And I think a very good example is this book by Michel Houellebecq, Soumission, Submission, published a few years ago, which was a kind of dystopia on how France would gradually become a Muslim country. And here you see he makes the analogy with the barbarians who invaded Rome and ended the classical and beautiful Roman culture and replaced it with a culture with different values, such as, I mean, the barbarians, so it says it all, but in today the risk is that the immigrants to Europe will bring other hierarchies, submission of women, respect to the elders, and so on. Okay, so that's very much what we talk about today in Europe. In the US as well, the Trump era was an era of where this threat, the cultural threat of immigration, was very much salient. And here there is a quote not from Trump, not about the US, but about Europe, where he warns European leaders that their culture essentially is at risk due to immigration. Now, some economists have talked about this question. I think the book Exodus by Paul Collier is a good example of a book where these negative externalities from migration on the social and cultural dimensions are most prominent. And in the review, interestingly, in the review of the book in the Journal of Economic Literature, George Bochas, probably the most well-known immigration economist, you know, is someone saying that, you know, immigration is not so good, and that immigration surplus, that the economic surplus that countries get from immigration is not so big. And then he says something like, with these negative externalities, it's even smaller or negative overall, because these immigrants bring with them the bad culture, the failed culture. Trump famously said that migrants coming from shitty hole countries would be a disaster for the US because of exactly because of that, of this bad culture, these bad institutions, these failed institutions that they import with them to the host country. Okay, so this is one thing, but this is not the whole picture. We will not talk just about this. We will talk about many other dimensions, and we situate ourselves mostly in a very rapidly growing and vibrant literature in economics on cultural change and persistence. Economists discovered maybe 20 years ago they have something to say about culture, and since then they wrote many papers. So the papers by Guizot and so on the persistence of cultural traits is quite well known. The work of Odette Galore on the deep-rooted factors of comparative development are also about culture, and you have here a few papers in this literature. There is also a literature on what happens within countries. So that's more for Gustavo. Do we have you know, cultural diversity? Is there cultural polarization? And so on, and especially in the context of the US, two recent papers by De Smet and Baxiag or by Bertrand and Kamenika are trying to document for now, and this is something which has been very much discussed in the context of the last US presidential election, to document the polarization of cultures in the United States. So there is this literature, and part of it, but also separate from it, there is that's more for Alessandra, literature on cultural change and globalization, how globalization and culture are linked. You know, is the world becoming more homogeneous? Is there a global village in the making? Is there an Americanization, a polarization of civilizations, and so on? And more precisely, as part of this debate, economists have tried to analyze some dimensions of globalization, such as trade, and ask whether trade was making exporting and importing countries, exchanging countries, trade partners, essentially more culturally similar or culturally different. But I think we are the first paper to look at this question through migration. And I would say migration is a natural candidate for the dissemination of culture, because culture is embedded in people and is moving with them. So what we will do in this paper is, I should say, before I go to this graph, to this figure, I should say what we do is to have a global view. Okay, it's not just looking at the receiving countries. We look both at the receiving countries and at the sending countries. We will argue that migration is also affecting the sending countries, not just the receiving countries. So we will look essentially at how migration is affecting the cultural distance between two countries. Okay, so here we have a very simple sketch of a model. We need the model because, and I'm really glad Gustavo is here, because I hope he will confirm what I will say. you can observe cultural distance over time. So here we have two countries, France and the United States as an example. We will define culture very roughly. We will say culture is essentially the cultural composition within a country as measured by the frequency of cultural types. And here in the model, we will have two cultural types, the blue people and the green people. And we will say France and the US are different because the proportions of green and blue people in the two countries are different. And we will ask whether migration will contribute to make the two countries culturally more similar or more dissimilar. And in the theoretical model, it would mean whether the proportions of the two types will tend to converge or to diverge. So we will be able to say empirically whether the two countries are culturally closer or culturally more distant. But we won't be able to sign empirically, I mean statistically, to sign which country has moved towards which. Okay, we can say, for example, the two countries become closer due to migration, which is indeed what we will find. But there is, without the theory, we wouldn't be able to say which country is moving toward which. Okay, so we will need the theoretical model to be able to make distinctive predictions on different mechanisms through which migration affects cultural distance. Okay, so here what you see on this figure is a sketch of the compositional model. We will start the theoretical model with a compositional model, which is very simple and intuitive. And if all we had to say would be about the compositional changes, we would not need a model, because with just a figure and some intuition, we can tell what's going on. So it's also nice to start with this figure because it's a way also to introduce notations and the different ingredients in the model. So we have two countries, A and B. A will be the sending country and B the receiving country. So in this example, France and the US. We have two cultural types, the blue people and the green people. You see that the blue people are a minority in France and the majority in the US, and the green people are the majority in France and the minority in the US. So just to give, I can use some examples. I have two favorite examples. One is taken from sports. So you could think of football lovers and baseball lovers. So in France, you would have a majority of football lovers and a minority of baseball lovers. And in the US, a majority of baseball lovers and a minority of football lovers. So that's one example. Another example I like is if instead of France and the US, I would use Italy and Germany. It could be punctuality. Okay, do you come on time to meetings or do you come late? So the Italians would be, on average, the majority would come late, and the minority would come on time. And in Germany, it would be the opposite. Okay, so now you think, why do people migrate? We will have two incentives for migration: an economic incentive and a cultural incentive. The economic incentive is just the wage differentials, the income differentials that could be positive or negative. So some people will gain economically from moving and some people will lose economically from moving. So that's the first reason why you would migrate, if you have an economic gain. But we also assume homophily, meaning that you like to be surrounded by people of the same type as you. So if you're a football lover, you like when there are other football lovers, and if you like to be, you are punctual, you come on time to meetings, you like the others to be the same. Okay, so it means that for the minority in the sending country, there is a cultural gain from moving, while for the majority in the sending country, there is a cultural loss. So combining these two incentives for migration, people will move if they have an overall gain from migration, which is the sum of their economic gain and the cultural gain, because the cultural, we will assume the economic gain is distributed independently of cultural types. So for economic reason, the blue people and the green people have the same reasons to migrate, but the blue people have an additional incentive, which is the cultural one. They have a cultural gain from moving, while the green people have a cultural loss. This is why the blue people, the minority type, is overrepresented among migrants. And this is what is called self-selection. And here it's cultural self-selection. Okay, there is a self-selection on cultural dimensions, which explains why the cultural minority is overrepresented among migrants. So what you see here is that because of this overrepresentation, self-selection will be a source of cultural divergence between countries. The few baseball lovers will migrate disproportionately, meaning that the proportion of baseball lovers in France will go down. So this self-selection creates divergence. Okay, it makes the proportions of the two cultural types more different in the two countries. Now, what happens at destination? You could have only baseball lovers coming, or you could have baseball lovers which are more than the proportion in France, but still less than the proportion in the US, which is the interesting case. And in that case, where you have, say, 10% baseball lovers in France, 80% baseball lovers in the US, and baseball lovers are maybe 30% or 50% of the migrants from France to the US, then you will have mixing in the US. And this mixing, this melting pot, compositionally will be a source of convergence, because it will make the proportion, the cultural proportions of the two countries closer one to the other. Okay, so compositionally, we can say we have two forces: self-selection, which is a force of divergence, and most likely mixing, which is a source of divergence. Of course, if we have only baseball lovers, and there are 100% baseball lovers among French migrants to the US, then the proportion of baseball lovers in the US will increase, and we will have another source of divergence. But this is unlikely in the sense that this would require a very extreme selection. Okay? So that's for the compositional model. So if that was all, if these were the only mechanism at hand, we would just, test whether when we have more migration, we have convergence or divergence. And in case we find convergence, we say then mixing is dominating. And mixing means the host country is converging toward the home country. But if we find divergence, it means that the self-selection is dominating, and we would say the sending country is diverging away from the host country. Okay? So I spoke about the two compositional channels that you see on the left panel of this table. Now, if that was the whole story, it would not be so interesting, because the real action, we believe, is not the compositional or the static channels, but the diffusion channel, the channels of cultural diffusion, which are dynamic. And here, when we talk about cultural diffusion, we can see three types of cultural diffusions. One going, this is the one I mentioned in the beginning, from immigrants to the natives of the host country. This is, we suggest to call this cultural dissemination, whereby the host country population adopts migrants' culture. And this is a source of cultural convergence, very much as mixing. We have assimilation. This is when migrants adopt the host country values, and it's a source of cultural divergence. It's kind of, canceling the mixing element. And we can have, lastly, cultural remittances, which Alessandra mentioned. I don't know if it was before we started the recording or not, but she mentioned the work of Peggy Levitt on social remittances. So for the sake of this paper, we will call them cultural remittances, whereby the migrants remit the host country culture back home. So here the natives of the home country adopt the culture of the destination country. And this is the source of cultural convergence. So you see that now that we have all these mechanisms together, it's not enough to test empirically whether when we have more migration between two countries, they tend to converge or to diverge culturally. Because if we find convergence, for example, it could be compositional due to mixing, or it could be due to cultural diffusion, but due to the host country adopting the migrant's culture, what we call dissemination, or the home country adopting the host country culture, which we call cultural remittances. So how can we know if we see convergence, if it's mixing, dissemination, or remittances? And same thing, if we find divergence, is it due to selection or to assimilation? And for this, we will need a model to guide us through this complex question. Now, before I turn to the model, I just want to mention very briefly that there is a big literature on each of these channels I mentioned. There is a big literature on cultural selection. One example is political selection called Exit in the framework of Albert Hirschman. There are many papers about, selection on political views and preferences, and I have currently a paper with Thomas Barsby on Germany about this question. But you can select on other cultural dimensions, on individual values and social norms. I guess you've seen the paper by many co-authors, including Andrea Ichino, on polarization, cultural polarization coming from south to north migration in Italy on what you call civicness or moral values. There is this working paper by Beck Knudsen showing that the more individualist people are the ones who left predominantly Scandinavian countries in the late 19th century, or on different things, on religion, on fertility. There is this book by Massimo Livi Bacci, who is someone we love very much. And he has this quote, for example, in his book on migration, about the fact that there was selection into internal versus international migration based on preferences for fertility. Okay, so many big literature on different dimensions of culture showing there is cultural selection on political views, on fertility preferences, on religion, on moral values, and so on. There is a big literature on mixing and essentially outside of economics. This is the melting pot story. There is, of course, a lot of work on assimilation of immigrants, and most prominently by Rana Bramitsky and co-authors for the United States. There is some evidence, not so prevalent, I would say, on cultural dissemination. The fact that immigrants disseminate their culture to the native population. There are two recent papers, one by Zhorodskin and Zoravskaya, on the deportations that Stalin made in the early 40s of Chechens and of Germans to Siberia, and how the Siberian populations evolved culturally differently depending on whether they've been mixed with Germans or with Chechens. And this paper on by Giuliano and Tabellini on the dissemination of preferences for redistribution in the US for Europeans, from Europeans that came in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, coming from countries with strong versus weak support for redistribution. Okay, and last but not least, on cultural remittances, there is the work of Peggy Levitt, of course, in sociology and anthropology, and in economics, a few papers, including a paper of mine, again, with Toman Barzbai and two other co-authors on Moldova. That's for political remittances. There are papers on what I call Malthusian remittances, which is the transmission of preferences for fertility or for gender equality, and so on. Okay, so this is just to say that each of these mechanisms in itself is well documented, but we want to know how do all these potential mechanisms whereby migration affects culture, how do they aggregate together, and which one is the dominant one, okay, which is able to explain the various empirical results we will show. So what we do, as I said, we will start with a model, essentially to model the dynamic mechanism, the mechanisms of cultural diffusion. Then we will develop a set of measures of cultural proximity, so statistical measures. And then we will test using our left-hand side the cultural proximity measures over time, how they evolve with depending on the intensity of migration between the two countries. Okay, and the sources of data for the left-hand side is the World Value Survey, which is a survey asking many questions on different dimensions of culture. And for the migration data, we will use the World Bank bilateral migration data. And the goal eventually, as I said, is to be able to discriminate between the different candidate mechanisms, candidate to explain the empirical findings. Okay, so the model, I'm usually very bad at managing time, so I think I have 1 hour, right, Alessandra?
Yes, more or less 1 hour, yes.
Okay, so I will be quick for the model because I gave you already the ingredients, you know, two countries, A and B. There is a gain from economic gain, G, from migration, which has a cumulative distribution, big G. There is homophily, meaning that you have a utility gain if you move from a country where your cultural type is a minority and you go to a country where it's a majority. And so you can put a weight beta on the economic gain and a weight 1 minus beta on the cultural gain, and the decision to migrate will take place if your overall gain, the sum of your economic and your cultural gain, is positive. Okay, so I think quite intuitively you can measure pi. Pi is will be the proportion of the minority type in the home country among migrants. Okay, so that's the degree of self-selection. Okay, so I, the notation I is for the minority type. We have two types, I and J. So I is the minority type in the home country, the majority type in the destination. And that proportion depends on the frequency QA and QB of each type, of this minority type in country A and country B. Okay, Q by definition is the proportion of, say, baseball lovers in France and of baseball lovers in the US for QB. So GI is the critical individual, the threshold, the one for which the economic gain and cultural gain, the sum of the two is just equal to 0. And so that will give us the proportion of people who migrate among those of type I in country A. So that will give me the number of baseball lovers from France migrating to the US. And this is the same thing, plus the proportion of football lovers, type J. So we have the sum of migrants, the total number of migrants, the number of type I baseball lovers in France, and their proportion is this, okay? So pi will be between 0 and 1. I'm just explaining the very important ingredients. If we go to the limit, assume we set beta to 0, so no economic gain, only culture matters. So then we will be only baseball lovers. We have complete total cultural selection, extreme cultural selection, which will create divergence, okay, because there will be less baseball lovers in proportion in France and more in the US. So clearly two countries diverge. But if beta equal 1, culture doesn't matter because the economic gain is distributed independently of culture. We will have migrants will be a random sample of the French population. So there will be strong mixing when they arrive to the US, which will be a source of convergence. That's for the compositional model. Now, the interesting case, of course, is when you have beta between 0 and 1, and actually the empirical exercise will be around that notion to test for which type of workers, for which type of country pairs, do we have strong economic gains versus strong cultural gains and so on, okay? But this is already an indication that according to the compositional model, if we have little cultural selection, we can expect convergence because mixing will be dominating. But if we have a lot of cultural selection, then we can expect divergence, okay? So that's the intuition for the predictions of these two, the model for these two mechanisms, okay? Now we move to the dynamic model. We build on the Bizin and Verdier framework of cultural transmission that dates back to the year 2000. And we extend this model to a two-country setting with migration. Okay, in their model, we have just one country, and they look at the evolution of cultural types within a country with the idea that you have parents who want to socialize their child as theirs. They try to convey to the child their own cultural type because they prefer the child to be of the same type as them. So they will put an effort. They spend some part of the time, and this effort is denoted tau I. So with tau I would be the probability of success. Okay, the level of effort is also your probability of success. So you invest 80% of your time, so you have 80% chance of success. You invest 10% of your time, you have 10% chance of success. Okay. Now, with the complementary probability, if you don't succeed in socializing your child, what will happen to the child? Well, the child will go to the park and will pick at random a friend or a role model and will adopt the cultural type of the friend or the role model. And that will happen based on, so that will be type I or type J, depending on the proportions of each type in the child environment. Okay? So overall, if you are, so this is what I'm explaining now is the dissemination model. Okay, so the dissemination model you have to think is an American child and an American parent. The parent is of type I, so he's a baseball lover. He puts some effort, say 20% of his time is dedicated to you know, giving baseball caps and bats as presents for the child, and buying him jerseys and taking the child to Red Sox games if they are in Boston. And with that probability, the child become a baseball lover. But with the complementary probability that the child is not interested in the presence given by the parent, and it's not interested in going to games with the parent. He wants to play in the park. And there it will make friends. Okay, so with a certain probability eta h, that friend will be an American, and with probability, the complementary probability 1 minus eta h, that friend will be a migrant. Eta is the proportion of natives in the population, and 1 minus eta is the proportion of immigrants. And natives are baseball lovers with a certain probability, QH, and they are football lovers with the complementary probability. And same thing for migrants and so on. So you play with those different probabilities, which are given by the proportions of types and of migrants and so on. And overall, what is the likelihood a child who is a child of a baseball lover becomes himself or herself a baseball lover is this psi, okay? So it's tau, the probability that the child goes after the parent, plus psi, which is the probability that the child picks a role model who is a baseball lover. Okay, so that probability that the child picks a role model which is a baseball lover depends on pi, which is the proportion of baseball lovers among migrants. You remember that pi times the probability to meet an immigrant plus the probability to meet a native times the probability that native is a baseball lover. Okay, so you see how it works. Then the parent will choose the endogenously the optimal level of effort. Should I dedicate 10% or 20% or 50 or 80% of my time? And so he's maximizing this function, which is the utility the parent derives from the child being of the same type. And this is the probability that the child becomes of same type. So it depends on the parent effort plus the complementary probability that the child picks up a role model which is same type, and the complementary probability that the type becomes type J times the utility the parent derives from his son being of the other type. Okay, you still love the child, but not as much as if the child was same type as you, minus the cost of effort, which is a quadratic function to make sure we have internal solutions. So you look for this optimal tau, and you play a bit with equations, and you come up with the steady state equilibrium, where you have the steady state or equilibrium proportions of the two cultural types in the host country. This will be the case. Intuitively, this equation means that the number of children born in a type I household who become type J is equal to the number of children who are born in a type J household and become type I. Okay, so these changes are equivalent to the ratio of them equals to 1. And then this you can you have this implicit solution, which is QH star, on which you can do some comparative statics. And I will focus on just one. So those comparative statics are some predictions of the model. And it's quite intuitive. Here you would see that dQH star on d pi is positive. What does it mean? It means that the more cultural selection you have, so the more baseball lovers you have among migrants, the higher the proportion of baseball lovers in the US at destination in the steady state. Okay, so the more selection, the more divergence. Okay, so that's the prediction, which is very intuitive for the dissemination model. I will skip the assimilation model for the sake of time and move to cultural remittances. So cultural remittances is exactly the same, but here we model the cultural dynamics in the home country. okay, in France, in the sending country. Exactly same notations, except that Q now is the proportion not at host but at home. And here, and it's counterintuitive, when you play with these equations, you have that the proportion of baseball lovers in France increases with the initial selection of migrants. Why? Because of two things. Intuitively, so here under the cultural remittances model, the prediction is that the more selection you have on culture, so the stronger the cultural selection, the more convergence you will have, because the proportion of baseball lovers in the home country eventually at the steady state will increase. And this is driven by two things. The fact that you can pick your uncle of America as a role model. So migrants, this is exactly what we talk about when we mention cultural remittances, is that you take the culture of the migrants at destination, you take the migrants at destination as role model if you want. Okay, so either more that left on the one hand, so you are more likely to adopt them as role model, the minority type, and also in France, because initially the proportion of baseball lovers goes down, you have more incentives to invest more time to, if you are a small group, it's more likely that if you don't succeed, the child will pick up a role model of the different types. So this is an incentive for you to invest more effort. So these two things combined, the higher effort of parents of the minority type, plus the fact that you can pick immigrants as role model through cultural remittances, means that in the steady state you will have more baseball lovers, more, the minority type will grow more than the majority type. Okay, so you will have convergence. So you see two very different predictions. If when you have more cultural selection, you have convergence, this is consistent with cultural remittances. If when you have more selection, you have more divergence, this is consistent with the dissemination or with the compositional model. And this is what we will test, okay? So I will have to be very, very fast on the data part, but you know the world value survey. We use 6 waves between 1981 to 2014, and our main variable of interest is migration, for which we use World Bank data from 1960 to 2010. So you see that the timing of the wave is not the same. It's 5 years for culture and 10 years for migration. So we do simple interpolations so that the measurement of migration coincides with the measurement of culture. Yeah, this is just a graph showing, exploiting part of the world value survey to show that Germany and Japan would appear similar if it was measured by just the ranks of the most important values you want to transmit to your children compared to Spain, showing that cultural similarity and geographic similarity are not necessarily the same. And this is a simple principal component representation of these dimensions. And you see some clustering of countries geographically, which say that still geography matters. But look at the bottom right, for example, you see Taiwan, Japan, but also Netherlands, Germany, Sweden in the bottom right part of the graph. Okay, so anyway, what we do will be quick, and if you have questions, you ask Gustavo. Because he's the master here. So we use 3 different measures of cultural similarity: the Euclidean distance, the Canberra distance, and the Erfindal. Just to say we do it for robustness, because we don't want our results to be driven by our choice of cultural distance measure. There is no strong reason to prefer one of them. The Euclidean distance is essentially looking at the average distances for average individuals, average over questions for a representative individual. Canberra is giving more importance to the range, And the Erfindal, as you know, is the probability that two randomly picked individuals in the two countries are culturally similar. Okay, so this, yeah, so these are measures of cultural similarity. Okay, that will be important for the interpretation of the empirical analysis that you see here. So we take these measures of cultural similarity between, so be careful here, I and J are for countries, not cultural types. This is something probably we should change in terms of notations. So I would be the home country, the origin country, J is the destination country, and T is the period. So we will look at this cultural similarity as measured by our three measures between two countries at a given time, okay? And we regress this cultural similarity on our variable of interest, migration between I and J, which will lag by one period. And in the baseline, one period is 5 years, okay? So we would look at the cultural similarity between France and the US, or between Italy and Germany. And we want to know whether the migrants that moved between the two countries in the previous period of 5 years before, how did this migration relate positively or negatively to cultural similarity? And we have a few time varying controls at the bilateral level. So we will control, for example, for GDP per capita, we will control for trade between the two countries and so on, FDI and whatever we can control for. And we have a rich structure of fixed effects because we have a pair fixed effect, so country-country or pair or bilateral fixed effect. And we have country time fixed effects, both for the host and the home and host country. So this is important because it means we're controlling for many, many things, right? We're controlling for whatever makes Italy be Italy in 2000, in 2005, in 2010, and so on. We control for whatever makes Germany be Germany in 2000, 2005, 10, and so on, since the 80s, actually. And we are controlling for whatever makes the pair Italy-Germany or France-US be what it is, the distance between them, whether they have a border, common language, and all kinds of things, okay? So all the traditional gravity variables you would have in a cross-sectional exercise, which are time invariant, okay? All right, so I think I defined everything here. So I can move to quick discussion of identification. There are three things we need to address. Unobserved heterogeneity, this is why we have this rich structure of fixed effects. As I mentioned, we're controlling for many, many things. The reverse causality, which we address in two ways. The first is that in three ways, actually. We lag migration by 5 years. We will lag it also by 10 years. So the more we lag it, the less likely the reverse causality, which is real, that cultural proximity affects migration, and not just migration affects cultural proximity. So first, again, we lag migration by 5 years, but also with some robustness, we include the lag-dependent variable. So it's like a convergence, a beta convergence model, because we will include past cultural similarity as a control. And the last thing we do is to instrument, but we think it's more a robustness test rather than an attempt at a causal interpretation of the results. Because essentially what is important here to understand the mechanisms is the cultural composition of migrants, not so much its size. So we can instrument the size of migration, how many migrants, but we don't observe the cultural composition, so we cannot instrument for it. So whatever instrument we do, we don't know how it will affect our picking of migrants in terms of composition. Okay, so for robustness, when we instrument the size of migration, we find the same results. Okay, but we don't make more than this out of it. So what are the results? This is the baseline results for a balanced sample. So it's for the unbalanced sample, excuse me, because the world value survey is not, it's not longitudinal, it's asking a cross-section of individuals, representative. It's a representative sample, but it's a repeated cross-section for each countries, and the countries surveyed are not always the same in all waves. So when we use all the information in the unbalanced panel, we find positive significant coefficient for migration, creating more cultural similarity, so a source of convergence in 2 out of 3 measures. The third measure is not significant, but it's positive. The coefficient is positive. When we try to have a balanced panel, so we need to reduce the sample drastically. To have a balanced panel, you see here with the unbalanced panel, we have nearly 6,000 observations, and we fall to 1,359 to have a balanced panel on 3 waves. But here you see that the coefficients are all positive and significant. So at face value, we would say migration is a source of convergence. But we want to know, it's not enough. We want to know who converges to whom. Is it Italy becoming more German, so the Italians becoming more punctual, or the Germans becoming more Italian and adopting a more relaxed attitude towards punctuality? Okay. So let me skip this. So what we do is, first thing we do is in the baseline, the lag for migration and for trade and so on is 5 years. So we can say let's put 0-year lag or 10-year lag. Okay, you see on the right panel of this table that when we put 0-year lag, so we look at contemporaneous relationships, there is nothing. Okay, so it suggests it's not compositional. If the relationship between migration and culture would be compositional, it should show up immediately. And this is not what we see. If, on the contrary, we believe in diffusion mechanism, in dynamics, we should have even stronger effects when we increase the lag. And this is what you see here. With the 10-year lag, we have about the same coefficients actually, but they are all significant. So this is the first thing we say. We have 5 mechanisms. We can eliminate the compositional one. They are unable to explain the overall results. Okay, if the compositional mechanism were the dominant ones, we would see all of the effect here when you have 0-year lag rather than here when you have 10-year lag. Okay, but now what do I have? I have convergence, and I know convergence is driven by diffusion, dynamic mechanism. So I have 2 candidates left. I have dissemination and I have cultural remittances. So which one is the winner? Which one is the winner? We will address this. Remember, the theoretical models tells me that if I have strong cultural gains resulting in strong cultural selection, I should have more divergence or less convergence according to dissemination, but more convergence according to remittances. Okay, so this is what we will test. We will look at the intensity of the economic gains versus cultural gains. So here, let me first ask you a question. That we will do this in 2 ways. We will compare type of migrants, skilled, unskilled, and type of pairs of countries. So for migrants, which type of migrants, if I have 2 types, skilled and unskilled migrants, which one would you say have the strongest economic gains from migration? Who gains more from migrating economically, the low skill or the high skill? That's a question for you. You can just guess, but maybe it's an informed guess or not, but what would you, if you had to bet, what would you bet? Elisabetta, I know you know. I hope you do. Are you here?
The skill one.
Hmm?
I'm saying the skill one usually because they have a premium to go abroad. So the skill are reward more.
How do you measure the premium? In absolute or in relative terms?
By relative terms, of course.
So then in relative terms, you should say the low skill.
The low skill.
The low skill, yeah, because in relative terms, the low skill multiply their wages by more than the high skill do. And this is essentially the assumption which is made in virtually all the economics of migration, of selection into migration, that it's based on the returns to skill and the returns, the relative return. Okay, so if you're low skill, you multiply your wage by 10, and if you high skill, you multiply your wage by 3. Okay, so
yeah, but this will depend also on the probability that you get a job abroad, right?
yeah, but still, okay. I mean, we can discuss this, but the assumption made in nearly all of the literature is really that it's the relative return that is determines the decision to migrate.
Yes, of course.
So resulting in likely negative selection once before you account for migration costs, barriers, and so on. So if this is the case, then you would assume that when you have low skill migration, let's see, okay? So here we just separated migrants between low skill and high skill, okay? So for the low skill, we find consistently negative, and for high skill, consistently positive. Of course, the coefficients are not always significant or are weakly significant, some are strongly significant, but the signs are consistent. Negative for low skill, positive for high skill. What does it mean? It means that if you believe the economic literature on migrant selection, so when you have low skill, you have more economic incentives. More economic incentives means less cultural selection, and less cultural selection leading to less convergence is consistent with the cultural remittances mechanism and inconsistent with the dissemination mechanism. For the high skill, they have less economic incentives and relatively more cultural incentives. More cultural incentives relatively leading to more convergence is consistent with the cultural remittances mechanism and inconsistent with the dissemination mechanism. So that's when we look at heterogeneous results for types of migrants. When we do so for pairs of countries, what we do is to build this dummy, CSED, which means countries for which, pairs of countries for which we have high cultural similarity, CS. So high CS means small cultural gains. If the two countries are culturally similar, you don't gain much by migrating. And high economic distance. So for this interaction term, it means I'm capturing the pairs of countries where economic incentives are strong and cultural incentives are small. Okay, so I see that for these pairs of countries where I have relatively strong economic incentives and small cultural incentives, okay, so small cultural incentives means little selection. I see little selection, little convergence, less convergence because the interaction term is negative. It's consistent again with cultural remittances and inconsistent with dissemination. So whatever we can do as discriminative test based on the model, we find support for cultural remittances and reject dissemination. Okay, all of the evidence is in favor of our RAM, remittances, cultural remittances mechanism over DSM, which is dissemination. And the last thing we do empirically is a number of plausibility checks of this result. If this is correct, then there are a few implications that we can test. Okay, I show you maybe, I don't know which ones I have. I don't know what this is, and sorry. Okay, so let me just show you two such plausibility checks. Again, if cultural remittances is the driving mechanism for our results, do you expect the results to be strong for countries, for emigration countries, for home countries, which have a diverse emigration pattern or a concentrated emigration pattern? Okay? So I want the, there is a, okay. So that, I'm sorry, I have a missing table. Yeah, no, that's the table, okay? But before I show you the result, give me your intuition. Okay, if cultural remittances matter, are the ones that are important, do they manifest themselves more for countries who send most of their migrants to just one or two destinations, or for countries who send their migrants to many different destinations? What is your intuition? I should find stronger results for countries, for emigration countries, for home countries, which have a diversified or a concentrated emigration pattern. Alessandra, help me.
Yes. Thank you very much, Hillel.
No, I'm not done. You need to answer the question, but I will
Yes,
start with
sure.
that.
You can take off the slide.
Yeah.
Stop.
So just
So
to
we can
say,
see.
it's for
To answer you,
concentrated.
okay.
Okay.
There is.
So just let me finish with just an example. Take Mexico and Brazil. Okay, Mexico, most of their immigrants go to the US. So you would expect Mexico to be affected by the culture in the US. But Brazilians go everywhere, to the US, to other Latin American countries, to Spain, Portugal, and so on. So they get culture from many different places. So there is no reason. Probably the cultures compensate themselves and you don't have an effect. This is what this table shows, and it's a plausibility check of the validity of our conclusions. Okay, so to conclude, we do find that migration affects culture. We do find that migration is a source of cultural convergence, but the direction of convergence is from the home country coming closer to the host country and not the opposite. So the views about the great replacement culturally would seem really exaggerated. And if anything, immigrants in France or in Italy contribute are not a threat to the French or Italian culture, but are exporters, are ambassadors of those cultures which they send abroad and are adopted by their families, relatives, and so on. Thank you.
Hillel, thank you very much. Your paper is so dense and so rich that is complex to follow. We have a question in the chat, and I leave immediately the flow to also the other speaker. By Sophie, she was interested on migration culture domination, if there is any study of migrant group dominated to host community, cultural, politically. There is a case in Georgia in which they are having this situation that environmental migrants dominate on host community, and there is a process of competition, sometimes visible, sometimes invisible, between these two groups. I know nothing about Georgia about this case.
No, I don't know either. And of course, this is a cross-country exercise, or what we can say is for an average pair of country, what happens, and this average is a mix of different things. And our conclusion is not to say there is no dissemination. It is to say the dominant force is cultural remittances. So again, to use this metaphor of, you know, I don't know, Gustavo, if it's a metaphor you would adopt, but for me, it's like, you know, looking at the sky and the distance between stars. You can measure the distance between stars at two different points in time, but you cannot say which star becomes closer to the other. You just can tell the distance. And this is why we need the model, to be able to tell us, you know, it started like this, it's like this. And with the model, we can say if, you know, we came to this from the home country coming here or from the host country coming here. So the two, but it's possible, of course, that the two move, but what we say is that the home country is moving more toward the host country than the opposite.
Yes, and you had also a section in the paper in which you distinguish the country by size, because small country, rich country, and so on, which is a way to see how there and which it
By
is
economic, by status, like rich countries, south, north, north, south, and so on.
Exactly.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, but Roberta would like to intervene. Roberta Misurata is working with us since next month.
Okay, thank you. First of all, many thanks for this and for all your highly inspiring works. So I have already read your work. So I have a question about the identification problem. So are you surely know or studies about the impact of immigration on host country are concerned with endogeneity? In this case, I could imagine that regions with different economic or social characteristics will attract more or less migrants. Moreover, immigrants, tend to choose the country of destination based, for instance, on the presence of previous enclaves. So I don't know if I understand correctly, but in this study, you do not address the problem of endogeneity, even if your baseline specification lags bilateral migration by 5 years, and this may be partially mitigate reverse causality concern. Is it correct?
Do you want to collect the question, Hillel, or do you want to answer each by one?
No, I think.
I have another question, but
okay. Let's take.
okay. Tell me if you prefer one or.
No, I'll take questions, and I have another meeting at which is good for you because I could go on for hours, but I have a meeting at 3:30, so then I prefer to collect questions, and then I can, you know, share the time between them.
Okay.
So, Roberta, you had another question.
Yes, the other question is, so when you talk about cultural assimilation, cultural convergence or divergence, so have you considered the role of factors such as cultural fractionalization, polarization in the destination country? That is, the fact that the sides of the cultural groups in which the immigrants aims tend to integrate could modify the outcome of cultural divergence or convergence, as in Bazzi, for example. Thank you.
Salvatore Carrozzo.
Hi, Hillel. Thank you for your presentation. I have 3 questions, very brief. The first one is about the theoretical model. So basically, your model is a one-stage game because you have full information about the characteristics of the market. And basically, my guess is that migrants might decide to go back because their beliefs are different. They have some beliefs about the characteristics of the types in the host country, and maybe I don't know if you can extend the model with the beliefs instead of full information about markets, so no asymmetric information. The second question is about why don't you use the share instead of the levels in the empirical specification. And the third question is a more broad question. It's about the role of mass media in social remittances, because you have to basically there is a difference between the past and today, because now we have mass media, and so the type of social remittances might be different than before. So it might be different studying the effect of migration on social remittances in 1981 and in 2010. Thank you.
Okay. Elisabetta, do you have any question?
Thanks, Hillel. No, I think that it's very interesting. Just so the channel is through remittances, so basically cultural remittances. Maybe you said that, but I didn't focus. So the magnitude is greater for which country? South, North migration, I guess that are more distant in terms of cultural distance, or north-north migration or south-south migration. My intuition is should be more in terms of south-north, but maybe I'm not right, I don't know. So
Yeah.
if you can say a few words on this.
Okay.
Gustavo, do you want to intervene?
Thank you.
No,
No.
no thanks.
Okay.
I'm just an onlooker.
So, Hillel,
No,
I leave the
between
floor to you.
Gustavo and I'm the one asking him questions. So is it okay, my metaphor about the sky and the distance between stars? Do you agree with the fact that we cannot sign statistically the direction of convergence if there would be no model?
Yes, but I was wondering whether you could measure the distance from what Italy, for instance, Italy and Germany. You know how Italy was 10 years ago, how Italy is today, how Germany was 10 years ago, how Germany is today. Why don't you try to measure that?
So we did, but it's like measuring a star in the sky of today to a star in the sky of yesterday. So it's a deep. It sounds easy, but it's a deep question, and we talked to many people about that. That's actually what we did in the first version of the paper we had, and decided we were not convinced it makes full sense. But I'm happy to hold this discussion bilaterally if you agree later on. And I will use my 8 minutes to try to answer the question that was asked. I will go from last to first. So Elisabetta, yes, indeed, we have a table. I had to skip it where we look at subsample for north-north, south-north, and south-south, and all of the results, as you anticipated, are driven by south-north corridors. Okay, so and it's consistent with you can see it as a plausibility check that it's cultural remittances. Now, but the difficulty is for the mechanism is not enough, because south homes and northern destinations have both big economic distance and big cultural distance. Okay, so in terms of mechanism, you still cannot tell with this. You have to go with our double dummy for the interaction of high cultural similarity, high economic distance. Okay, that's why this is the one we use. Salvatore, you ask clever questions, and I can see they are clever, but it takes time to think about the answer. So I will just say that I think you meant social media rather than mass media, because mass media were present, already in the early 20th century. But yeah, an implication is that, and this is an exercise we plan to do, is that the impact of migration should decrease over time. Okay, if this is what you believe, and it is the simple test of this. And that should be all the more true if social remittances are the mechanism, because if it's dissemination, then it's driven more by having contacts, which do not go through social media, while contacts between migrants and their home country go through internet and so on. Okay, so yes, definitely this is a test we want to add as a plausibility check. I didn't get the share and levels, but I don't think we have time. And for the beliefs, I think it would be an entirely different model, even though in the end, I think we would come up with the same predictions. So that's something we can do, but we try to be as parsimonious as possible and build on an existing model we extend. I think is the right way to do. I think it would be interesting to write maybe a theoretical paper on this, but here the model is really to serve as a motivational exercise for the empirics and the guidance for the empirics. And last but not least, to Roberta's questions. So you have two questions. The second one, I think what we do is econometrically correct, because fractionalization, first, these things are quite persistent. So they would be in the country fixed effect. Even if they change over time, that's captured by the country time fixed effect. But still, I think your question is interesting. You can think as another dimensions of heterogeneity, would we believe that we have more or less of an impact in countries which are strongly polarized or more diverse and so on? That's an interesting question to look at, but I don't think it implies to change the empirical analysis. I see it more as an addition. And regarding identification, here I had to be quick on this, but yes, there are, let's say, three issues. One is the omitted variable, and I think with our structure of fixed effect, we're controlling for many, many things. Still, you may think that there are time variant bilateral variables that could jointly drive migration and cultural similarity. So we control for a few things, like FDI, like trade, and so on, but there's a limit to what we can control for. But I think the scope for endogeneity in terms of confounding factors is very small, given our structure of fixed effect. So I would say as a researcher, I think we're good. As a referee, we are, of course, looking for, comment on dit des poux dans la tête, Alessandra?
Oui, c'est ça.
Okay. Anyway, you see what I mean. And indeed, we do have these lagged variables and the past cultural similarity as control. And also the last thing that I mentioned about the IV, two things are important here: the size and the cultural composition. Okay, how many migrants? You would expect more of an effect when you have more migration, but in terms of mechanism, what really matters is the cultural selection, and this is not something you can instrument. So that's the second reason why we rely on theory. The first is the one I mentioned to Gustavo, that you cannot sign statistically the direction of convergence. The second is that you cannot instrument for cultural composition, and so you need to rely on some additional and discriminative tests that are provided by the theoretical framework. So I think that's the best we can do, but if you have a suggestion, I'm more than happy to hear.
Hillel, thank you very much. It's 3:30, so I think you have to abandon us. We are very sorry.
I'm coming next month to Torino. I know.
Yes,
we'll see
we can continue.
I will see you, and who else will be there?
Also Roberta, we will see also Roberta.
Okay.
We
It's
will
better, you don't
invite,
wanna-
if you want, our colleague from Milan, Gustavo. I don't know if you want to come. Anyhow, and you will meet my colleague working on cultural economics. Thank you very much
Thank
indeed.
you guys for the
Also
nice
on the
feedback.
side of my student.
And, see you for some of you in person in about 1 month.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye. Bye.